Hey everybody, Jim here, and in this video, I'm going to show you to set up Windows 11 within a VirtualBox virtual machine. So before we get started, I just want to mention, if you like this video, please feel free to like it and subscribe to my channel. And if you really want to hear from me, click that little alarm bell icon, and that way you'll get notified whenever I release a new video. So let's talk a little bit about what VirtualBox is and why you may or may not want to run VirtualBox. So VirtualBox is essentially some free virtualization software. And you can run VirtualBox on a wide array of operating systems, so Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, which is pretty awesome. It is free, which is great, and there are other free options out there, such as VMware Player. Now, I think VirtualBox is probably my favorite free option, although I do like VMware Workstation Pro just a little bit better. And some of the differences between VirtualBox and VMware, and most notably VMware Workstation Pro, is that paid version of VMware, you can also connect off to more enterprise VMware environments. So if you have a VMware ESXi server or you're running a VMware vSphere environment, you can use VMware Workstation Pro as kind of a remote tool to configure and console into your virtual machines, which is nice. That feature doesn't exist in VirtualBox or in the free VMware Player. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I like VMware a little bit better. But for the free option, I think VirtualBox is the best. So I'll walk you through downloading and installing VirtualBox next. So to download VirtualBox, just go ahead and click that giant download VirtualBox icon on the virtualbox.org website. If you need help getting to the virtualbox.org website, you can Google for it as well, and it's one of the first search results. And on that download page, you want to select the option that makes sense for your operating system. So I'm running Windows 11 at home, so I'm selecting the Windows Host option. So just choose your option. And then launch the installer, and you can install it generally with the default options. Click next, 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 install. And that'll generally be fine for most people. But of course, if you want to make some changes or know you need to make some changes, feel free to do that. So VirtualBox will run on a lot of different computers, but it's not going to run on every system. So some of the common gotchas where VirtualBox might not work correctly is if you have either a really old computer or B, if you have a computer that has a really low-powered CPU installed in it. For example, if you have an Intel Atom CPU or any of the Intel Celeron CPUs, and maybe even I think some of the Intel i3 CPUs, although I could be wrong, it may prevent you from running a virtual machine. Those features known as virtualization is built in generally to the more expensive processors. So just be aware of that. And if you're running a really old computer, it just might not support virtualization at all, although it's becoming less and less common because virtualization has been around for a long while now. If you do see an error message, something about Intel VTX or AMD-V not being enabled, I would Google for your computer model. So as an example, I have, let's say I had a Dell laptop, I could Google for Dell Latitude 7400, how to turn on Intel VTX. And generally, there'll be some instructions telling you how to turn that on in your computer's BIOS. Unfortunately, if you are getting the turn on AMD-V or Intel VTX, that option, the way you turn it on is totally different for every single computer. Each computer make and model will have its own process, which is why, again, I suggest Googling for your computer maker and see if you can find a guide about how to turn that on for your specific machine. If you're like me and you built a desktop computer, in that case, I'd recommend Googling for your motherboard. And I have to do this occasionally. I have an MSI Unity motherboard under my desk installed on my computer here, so whenever I do a BIOS update, for whatever reason, that option gets flipped off. So I have to go in, and I never remember exactly where it is. So I Google how to turn on AMD-V with my my AMD Unity motherboard by MSI. And then generally there's a guide. It's one of the first search results, and it's really easy to find. Just an option. It's kind of tucked away, but just be aware of that. So yeah, I have the application open now, and then we're going to go ahead next and get our Windows 11 install media so I can show you to set up your Windows 11 VM, which should be pretty cool. All right, so to download Windows 11, it's actually not too bad. Microsoft has actually published the ISO file, the installation media, directly to their website. So instead of having to find a way to get that ISO, or instead of having to use that awkward, media creation tool to make your ISO, if you just Google Windows 11 and find the link for download Windows 11, it's very convenient this time around. You just want to scroll down. It's still the last option, but at least it's on here. And you want to download this ISO file. So an ISO file is essentially a virtual DVD. And back in the day when when computers had actual DVD and CD drives on them, you could take this and you could burn it to the DVD and install Windows that way. Well, of course, most modern computers don't have optical disk drives built into them anymore. So nowadays, what you do is there's still these ISO files, but instead of burning it to a CD, you'll either burn it or essentially mount it to a flash drive, a little USB thumb drive, to install it on a physical computer, or you'll just take this and you'll mount it to a virtual computer to install Windows in a virtual machine. So ISO file is still really good for that. And I'm not going to cover it in this video, but if you are interested in installing Windows 11 on a physical computer, the tool that I'd recommend to use to make that bootable USB thumb drive is known as Rufus, R-U-F-U-S. Google around, there's some guides on there. I might make a video on that eventually as well. Or you could also try giving this media creation tool wizard thing a shot. I've never used it personally. I've used Rufus a lot, and I like Rufus quite a bit, which is why I recommend it. So I'm going to select Windows 11, click download, select my language, and I'm English. It's below the window, but I selected it. Click confirm. And then I can click this download button. Most modern operating systems are going to be 64-bit. If you see an option for a 32-bit operating system, generally you just want to leave that be. That is for like a very old computer or for a computer that's running like a very specific old legacy application. So most people want 64-bit operating system. And this file is relatively large. It's about 5 gigabytes in size. And if you have a fast internet connection and a fast computer, this will only take a minute or so to download. My network connection at home is fairly fast, and it's downloading at pretty good speed. If you have a slower computer, of course, it could take some time. I've seen it take anywhere from 2 to 3 hours if you have a slower internet connection. So just be mindful of that. Once this download is done, we can proceed now, or the next, with setting up our virtual machine and mounting it and actually kicking off the full Windows 11 install experience. So I'm going to pause the video for now, and we will resume in about 40-something seconds when this download is complete. All right, so it has finished downloading the ISO file, and I am going to get this virtual machine set up. So I got VirtualBox up and running right now, and I'm going to go ahead and click this new button. And then from here, this is going to walk us through creating our virtual machine. So thing number one we need to do is we need to give this virtual machine a name. I'm going to call this Win11 test, and you can name it whatever you want. Now, the really important thing to remember and to consider is that this folder right here. So I know a lot of people have maybe 2 hard drives. Maybe one is a small, fast solid state drive. Another one is a slower, more legacy data drive. Make sure you are aware of where you're saving this virtual machine. These virtual machines will be anywhere from 10 to 100 gigabytes in size in most cases. So they're going to take up a considerable amount of space on your computer. So don't put it on a small hard disk or a hard disk that has, a lot of space consumed. Otherwise, you're just going to fill it up. I'm going to leave it with this default directory for now. It looks like it's going to go in my profile onto a VirtualBox VM folder. And then you can go through and select the type of operating system you want to configure this virtual machine to run. So I'm running Microsoft Windows with Windows 11, so I have it selected. Now, let's say Microsoft releases Windows 12 and you're really eager to play around with it and you launch VirtualBox and there's not a Windows 12 label that you can select. My general advice is if you are selecting an uncommon or a really new operating system that isn't quite officially supported by VirtualBox or VM or whatever product, I would try to select whatever one's the closest fit. So if I was working with a new version of Windows, I would select Windows 11 because that's the newest version that I can choose. So that's my general recommendation. It may work, it might not, but that's what I would try first. But because Windows 11 is in here, I am good to go, and I'm going to click Next. I'm going to assign some RAM to this, and my recommendation would be try to keep it to at least 8 gigabytes for Windows 11. If your host computer that you're trying to run this on doesn't have enough memory, like let's say your computer at home only has 8 gigabytes, you could try running it with 4 gigabytes or 2 gigabytes, and it might run, but it's going to be a pretty slow experience. 8's kind of the minimum, in my opinion. Now, my host computer here has about 64 gigabytes of memory, which I believe is why this is topping out at 65,000 megabytes. That's about 64 gigs. So you want to make sure you're not over-consuming, because if you have, let's say, 65 gigabytes of RAM in your computer and you create a 65 gigabyte virtual machine, it's going to run really terribly because your host computer and that virtual machine will be fighting for resources. So think about what resources you have installed in your computer and make an appropriate decision. If you have 16 gigabytes of memory, which I know is kind of a common number nowadays, my recommendation would be set this to be 8. If you happen to have 32 gigabytes or more, set this to be 16. Unless you want to run more than one virtual machine at once or you have some other plans. And this does show it in megabytes, so 1024 times 16 is 16,384. So that's where this number comes from. But this is about 16 gigs. So I'll click next. I'm going to leave the default size of 80 alone. If you want to increase this or decrease it, you can configure this differently, but I'll leave it as the default for now. And I'm going to still leave it as the default VDI, the VirtualBox disk image. So there is some cool, I guess, third-party compatibilities built into this. If you wanted to open up a Hyper-V disk, you could open up those VHD files. If you wanted to try to open up a VMware disk, you could open up the VMDK. I will say generally the virtual machines aren't necessarily compatible with one another, but if you have like a virtual disk you want to mount within a VM, you could do that easily by adding it in and connecting it this way. I'm going to leave this as the general default VirtualBox disk image format and click next. I'll say dynamically allocated. This will essentially not consume or eat up all that space at once. It'll grow as I fill up the virtual machine, which I like. And now here, again, is we're going to choose what size chunks do we want this file to be in. We can have large chunks or small chunks. I'm going to keep it just in one giant file, but if you might be moving this around, especially to like a cloud service, like if you wanted to save this on Dropbox or OneDrive or something, you might want to consider making this smaller. Some file services, whether they be a File Explorer built into Windows or Dropbox or OneDrive, they tend to handle copying smaller files a little bit better. Like if you have a file that's 2 gigabytes of size instead of 2 terabytes in size, you can copy it and work with a little bit more with a little bit more management involved. And notice what I mean by that is if you have an 80 gigabyte file and it kind of craps out halfway through and you have to restart the transfer, you might be copying a full half of this again. You might be copying another 40 gigabytes before you even get to the stuff that you really had meant to finish. If you split this virtual machine into smaller chunks, like let's say instead of having one 80 gigabyte file, you have 22 gigabyte files. Let's say then the transfer, let's say you're moving this over to a new hard drive. If the full 80 gigabytes are consumed and you copy half of it, you can actually resume at the halfway point because it's done in chunks instead of one large file. So I'm going to leave this just as is for now. It's fine. There's some pros and cons to keeping it the big file or separating it into smaller chunks. I'm okay leaving it, but again, if you think you might be moving it around or moving it to like a cloud service, smaller chunks I find work a little bit better. Okay, so we are by no means done at this point. Now you might be tempted just to click the start button, and pretty soon you will end with disappointment. It's not going to work. It's going to ask you for this startup disk. I'm just actually going to close this off completely. Yeah, it's not happy with us. We can just power off this machine, and I'll show you a few more things we need to do. So I'm going to go into settings, and now there's kind of some advanced settings we need to tweak. So first off, we need to enable UEFI boot on here. So I'm just going to pull up my notes. I was poking around a while ago. I've only actually installed Windows 11 once in a virtual machine, and I did that for my VMware Workstation video. So there are some specific settings that we need to tweak. So first off, under System here, we need to make sure we have this EFI checkbox enabled. Then we want to make sure under Processor, where did that go? That we have enough virtual CPUs enabled. And my general recommendation would be 4. I usually recommend 4 kind of in any situation. I'm assuming you have at least an 8-core CPU. My CPU has a lot of cores. It shows 32 on here, so I have no problem in doing 4. But if you have a very old system or a smaller system, you might want to keep it just 1 or 2. If you over allocate your cores, this thing known as CPU time slicing will kick in. And that will essentially will make your computer and the virtual machine also run really slow. I could get into what time slicing is, but I won't. I'll save that for another video. But you want to make sure you don't over allocate. 4 is my recommendation, but use less if you need to. If you want to use more, you're welcome to do that as well. Now, I'm trying to think what else needs to be set. I'm going to try kind of as is for now. When I did my VMware video, the recommendation also was to set up a TPM. That might be kind of built in here. We'll have to see how it works. So what I'm actually going to do is I need to go ahead now and under Storage, click on the CD drive that is empty, and I want to mount an ISO file to this. So I'm going to click Choose a Disk File. I'm going to select my Windows 11 ISO, click OK, and now when I start up the virtual machine, in theory, it'll actually boot. We'll see if it works. Cool. All right. So if you do click into this, it tells you right away you can use right control to break out of this box. So, okay, I'm in here now and my mouse has gone away. To get my mouse back, I can just hit the right control key. By the right control key and my cursor comes back. Now, when I started this up, it flashed really fast, but it said, please press any key to boot from the CD or DVD. And I missed it and then tried to boot off of a network or any other secondary or third or fourth or however many boot devices it'll try, and it failed because there's no other boot media on here. So if you missed that cue to hit a key on your keyboard, you just got to click File, and you want to restart this. So where did that go? Okay, so we can just turn off the virtual machine, and now I'm going to quickly start it up, click in and hit a button so that way I can start the installer. So click Start, click in, capture, tap the key on my keyboard, and it says any key, so literally click in and hit any key on your keyboard, and eventually you'll see that spinning circle and the screen will turn blue, and then you know it's actually booting off of the DVD. It's kind of a tricky thing to get right because there is some timing involved. All right, so now let's start this installation. So it's pretty straightforward for the most part. You click Install Now, and it's going to ask you for a product key. I would recommend saying you don't have a product key. If you have one, you can put it in here, but keep in mind when you get those product keys, generally you can only activate them a few times before Microsoft will eventually cut them off. So if you plan on setting up a virtual machine and deleting it and setting up a new one and deleting it, you might run through those activations pretty quick. So my recommendation is select I don't have a product key and then license it later on if you really do need to license it. The disadvantage to now putting in a product key is it'll let you install whatever version of Windows 11 you want, which is pretty cool. But if you do eventually want to license it, it is beneficial if you have the correct version installed, so licensed correctly, and so weird features aren't pulled out because there are different feature sets in Home versus Pro versus Education, etc. My recommended version is this Windows 11 Pro. If you choose the N versions, these are meant more so for the European markets. Microsoft has been kind of regulated over in Europe. So they have things like a browser banner, so it doesn't default to Edge. And there's all these kind of weird like European laws. So Microsoft has this European version. It's the N version. Unless you're in Europe, I've never used it. I wouldn't recommend using it unless you're over in Europe. Then if you want to give it a try, feel free to. So Windows 11 Pro, click Next. And you might think, all right, let's get this install underway. But you get this error message and you think, dang. So even though we had set VirtualBox to use whatever UEFI or EFI boot, there's still some things that Windows 11 requires that VirtualBox doesn't yet fully support. I'm assuming they'll be adding in support soon, but it doesn't have things like a TPM, a trusted protection module. The secure boot support's kind of iffy at best. So we need to essentially go in and create a registry key to tell Windows installer to ignore that setting that is missing, that hardware that's missing. So it sounds really complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. It's pretty straightforward. All you have to do, and I say that easily, all you have to do is pull down Shift on your keyboard and F10, and this will bring up the command prompt. Now, within this command prompt, we're going to type in regedit. This will open up the registry editor. And the registry editor in Windows is kind of like the back end of the Windows operating system. It's essentially a big database that stores all of the settings and all the configuration information about a computer. So we can go in here and we can do some hackery type things to disable some of these checks. So we are then going to navigate to HKey local machine, system, setup, and we're going to right click here and we're going to say new key. And we're going to name this key lab config. And then within lab config, we're going to right click new, and we're going to say a 32-bit dword value. And we are going to name this bypass RAM check. And it's important that you have these all capitalized, or you follow the casing correctly. If you don't, I don't know if it's going to work. It may or it may not. And another bypass TPM check. And then another bypass secure boot. I'm not typing, I'm doing it in the wrong spot, so I gotta delete this. Whoopsies. The nice thing is if you do make a mistake, it's just the installer and you can quickly fix it. I did it again. Did that. Okay. New. Click on the right thing this time. 32-bit D-word value. Okay. And we're going to set each of these three items to have essentially the value or the data is set to 1. So we're just going to go ahead and click into them, type in 1, click OK, 1, OK, 1, and OK. We can now, at this point, go ahead and just close off our registry editor, close off the command prompt, close off Windows Setup, click Install now. And hypothetically, if we set those keys correctly, after I select Windows 11 Pro, it'll allow us to continue with installation. Just like that, like magic, we have continued. So you do need to select the license agreement, so go ahead and click that. And this is kind of the next tricky part. So I have never actually clicked that upgrade button. And I pretty much always click this custom button. I wish there was a button for like new install or clean install or something. As it's not as obvious as you think, but you actually want to click on custom. You want to select this drive 0, and this installation will happen. Now, the speed at which this installation occurs is completely dependent on the speed of your host computer. So my computer under the desk right here is relatively fast. I have a newer AMD processor, a solid state hard drive with plenty of memory. So it's going to take maybe 5 minutes at most. If you have an older computer, particularly if you don't have a lot of memory or RAM, or if you have a mechanical hard drive, this can take a long time. I've seen this take 2 or 3 hours. It can take a really long time. So the speed of your host computer really, really influences the speed of this process. It's essentially going to copy that data off of that ISO file into the virtual machine and then stage it for installation. It's going to then essentially configure Windows in this very kind of like blank canvas type of state, and it's going to reboot this VM, and then it's going to have us finish the customization. So it'll have us do things like create a local user account, tie it to an Active Directory or Microsoft account if we wish, and all those other kind of custom things. It's going to have us select our privacy options and all the general Microsoft stuff. So I'm going to pause this video for now. This will finish probably, I'm guessing, within the next 5 minutes or so, and I will continue when I notice it finishing up right down here. It's actually doing it kind of on its own. So maybe I don't even need to pause the video. And you'll see the restart screen that's going to pop up. It's kind of interesting, so I do just want to make sure that you all see it. So you can either wait 10 seconds and it's going to automatically restart, or if you're impatient, you can just go ahead and click Restart Now. Your computer is going to restart, and it's going to boot back up. So sure, I can click OK. I can go ahead. So I thought it was going to start back up. Try restarting it manually. Okay, there it goes. Now we're back up and running. Now, this process to actually configure Windows is also going to take a little bit of time as well. So if it seems kind of slow and sluggish, don't be too deterred. It's fine. It's normal if it's a little bit slow. And the first time you log into this virtual machine, it's also going to be slow as well. This is known as the first time login. So on a Windows system, when you create a user account, it's essentially going to stage it so the first time the user logs in, it's going to copy over from this default profile. These user profiles on a Windows system can be fairly large, anywhere from like 1 to 20 gigabytes in size, and it's going to make a copy of that. And unless you have an extremely fast solid state drive, that copying tends to take some time, so there's a delay. So if you've ever been like on a public computer, or maybe you've purchased a computer, the first time you log on to a device, it takes, forever, like minutes and minutes. But then maybe the next day or some other time you come back to the machine, and when you log in, it's like instant. And you're like, what the heck? Why is it so fast today? And it was so slow the other day. And that's that first time login. So the first time it copies over on the hard disk, essentially a copy of the default profile. But the second, third, however many other times you log into that system, that folder, that profile is already going to exist there. And it's essentially just going to be able to drop you into it. So the performance is much better the second times and beyond. And there's our Windows 11 splash screen. I'm in the US, I'm gonna click yes. And you can follow through this wizard. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously, select the values that make sense for you. I'm in the US. I have a regular US style keyboard. So it's a pretty straightforward install, but of course, customize those if you need to. It is nice if it does detect an active network connection, it'll ask and try to check for updates, which I think is a good thing, especially from a security perspective. And it wants us to also choose a name, which is also a big improvement over Windows 10, where it would just give you a random computer name. I'm going to call this Win11 Test to match the name of my virtual machine. I'm going to click Next. And whenever you change the name of a computer, it does have to restart. So it's going to reboot the computer, I assume. And it's going to boot back up. Sorry, so many pop-ups here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up for personal use and click Next. If you do work or school, it might ask you to join into Active Directory or Azure Active Directory. I'm just setting this up for a test, and Microsoft really wants you to sign into your Microsoft account. So if you want to bypass this, which I would kind of recommend if you're just doing this to play around with, otherwise you'll log into your Microsoft account and see like a bunch of different virtual machines, is you want to go into sign-in options. You want to say offline account, and then it will actually allow you, after you selecting skip for now, it'll actually allow you to make just a general, just local account, which I think is great. So I'm going to call my account name Jim. I'm going to set my password to just a standard password, nothing super secure, but it'll work fine. You have to set some security questions as well. Just setting up to be very basic. Oh, dang, I accidentally backed out, so I got to do this one more time. My apologies. Sign in options, offline account, skip for now. Jim, password of, what should I do? I think if I do the password of test, it's going to yell at me. Stupid security questions. And I'm personally not a fan that it makes you select these security questions at setup. I understand why it does. Just not a fan of them. Okay. And again, you can adjust your privacy settings. I'll just leave them all on for default. On my actual workstation here, I did switch some of those off. So do some reading if you are going to be setting this up and using it as like a real device. It'll check for updates again, restart again, and essentially drop you into a login window. So at this point, Windows is going to be more or less ready to go. But remember that first time you log in, it's going to be just a little bit slow because of that first time login delay. Just again, that virtual hard disk is going to be under load as it copies over that default profile as you log in for the first time. And we get this fun screen too. This will only take a minute or so, at least from my past few install attempts. Again, depending on your speed of your computer, folks. So if you're running a really old computer, don't expect this to happen immediately. It might just take a little bit extra time. All right, so the install finished, and it actually dropped me straight into the desktop. So here we are, we're in kind of full-fledged Windows. You can take a look around with this if you want. I'm not going to cover Windows 11 in too much depth in this video, but just a couple of things to check out is under the settings, if you scroll down to About, you'll notice that I had 16 gigabytes of RAM allocated, and so this number makes sense. So whatever you allocated is what's going to be available for use in this machine. Same thing with our processor cores, and if I go into like Windows Explorer and I look at the hard drive, you'll see that it's 80 gigabyte virtual disk. So just be mindful of that. Most of these settings can be tweaked later on. Adjusting the hard disk can be problematic, especially if you want to shrink it. It's generally easier to make it bigger than smaller, but everything is changeable and customizable, so it's not too much of a stress if you need to change things later on. I did want to mention when you are done with this, close it out, and you generally probably either want to power it off or save the machine state. If you just leave this thing running in the background, it will continue to consume your host computer's resources. And if I open up my local task manager, not within my virtual machine as this one is, but within my actual Windows computer that I'm logged onto now, my host computer. Let me launch it, task manager. You'll see that this virtual machine is like using, for the most part, a full 16 gigabytes of memory, which is why like a substantial amount of my system memory is being used. So it's good to shut this virtual machine down or suspend, and that'll free back those resources. So I'm going to power it off, which is essentially going to turn off the machine. And you'll notice almost immediately those resources are released, and my host computer here can use them once again. So just keep that in mind, because I've seen people that have had virtual machines running in the background for days, and the fans on their computers are constantly spinning. They're like, why is my computer so slow? And I'm like, well, it's because you're running that thing. Like, what are you using that for? And like, I don't know. I was using it because I needed this obscure piece of software, and it just runs in the background. So turn it off when you're not using it. Otherwise, your computer will be a little bit slow. So that's it for now. Again, if you like this video, please, please, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on notifications. I'd really appreciate it. But for now, that's it, and I will see you later.